For the last of the Crash Course videos, I'm going to look at what is going to be the hardest of our 4 new rules, namely existential elimination. To start, let's go ahead and draw our universe. This will help us see why we have to use this as an assumption rule rather than a straight move as we had for the first 3. So let's have a world or a universe. Here's our universe. And in this universe, let's have a bird box. Let's say that I give you the following sentence. There exists some x such that x is a bird. This tells you the following. This tells you that there is something in here that is a bird. What we don't know, however, is what particular thing it is. It could be an A, a B, a C, a D, etc. So, all we know is that there does exist something such that it is a bird. In order to move from an existential claim that there exists an X such that to some type of other existential claim, so let's broaden this out a little bit. So let's broaden this out and let's put this within the not a reptile box. Let's say I said for all of x, if x is a bird, then it follows that x is not a reptile. Let's say that my goal is to stipulate that there exists some x such that x is not a reptile. In order to get to this conclusion, I'm going to have to make a number of moves. The first move in this case is going to be to start an EE for the sake, or start an assumption for the sake of EE. We're always going to want to do this first, especially when we also have a universal, because of some of the restrictions that we have for EE. I'll go through those in a second, but first let's just go ahead and start. Let's assume BA. Why are we assuming BA? Well, let's go back over here. We know that something has the quality of being a bird, but we actually don't know which specific thing does. So, for the sake of argument, what we're doing is we're picking some arbitrary letter, in this case A, and asking what would follow if it were the case that that one specific thing, that A, had the quality of being a bird. Thus starts our subproof. Next, we can go back and do UE now. We can get BA arrow not RA. Now, you might be asking, why didn't I just do this one first? Well, let's quickly talk about the restrictions. For E, one of the restrictions is that those little letters, those particular letters, that A, cannot already be in our proof. It can't be in the proof through a premise, and it can't be in the proof from anything that we have introduced. So if we were to do line 4 first, well, we'd already have an A in our proof. And that would mean that when we try to assume for the sake of EE, we wouldn't be able to introduce BA. We'd have to introduce some other letter. And unfortunately, that would not let us get to our conclusion. So, always start an EE first before you do anything with any of the universals. Moving forward, though, we can see that if we have BA, then we have not RA. 3, 4, MPP. Now, our goal is an existential claim. There exists an X such that X is not a reptile. We are allowed to use EI here to go from 5, negation RA, to there exists an X such that X is not a reptile. Existential X, negation RX in line 6. That's 5 EI. However, we're not done. Notice that we're in a subproof here. We're in a subproof because we assume BA for the sake of EE. So we actually need to discharge that EE before we can close out the proof. In line 7, what we get to do is we get to rewrite, restipulate what it is that we wrote on line 6. And then we cite the line that has the existential in the initial premise, line 1. We cite the line where we introduce the assumption, line 3. And we cite the line where we reach the conclusion that we want to get, line 6. And we write EE. For our assumption numbers, every assumption number that we've already had or that we introduce gets an assumption number that matches the line number. 4 came from 3, 5 came from, it looks like, 4 came from 1. I can't read. 4 came from 1. 5 came from 3 and 4. 1 and 3. 6 came from 5. That's a 1 and a 3. But notice what happens on 7. Something's wrong here. Yeah. Hold on. That's wrong. And this is why you should not try to write these when you're sick. That should be a 2. That's a 2. That's a 2. That's a 2. So notice that here, we're not citing 1 at all for the entirety of the subproof. We only cite 1 when we close out the EE assumption. We write down a 1, we write down a 2, we write down a 3, and we have to discharge the 3. The 3 is an assumption for the sake of EE, and at the end of the day, we only want assumptions that were the original assumptions to be left standing. So this is how you would end up doing a proof using EE, even though what you're doing is proving an EI statement. Now, one of the things to note is that our restriction here says that little letters can't already be in the proof. We just went over that, or in a conclusion or goal. So that means one of the things that we're not allowed to do with EE is we can't do the following. We can't move from the instance that there exists in X such that X is a bird. Let's say we even try to introduce it as like BA. Assumptions are for the sake of EE. I actually am not allowed to conclude, therefore, BA. Citing 1, 2, 2, EE. I'm not allowed to do this at all. Why? Well, just because I know that there exists something such that it is a bird, I can't actually conclude which specific thing is a bird. As such, it's an invalid inference to assume something for the sake of argument, like we do on line 2 right here, and then to conclude that thing as if we've shown it necessarily to be the case. In assuming that something is a bird, I'm asking what would follow if that thing were a bird. Notice my emphasis on the word were. That's a hypothetical. It doesn't actually show us that that is actually the case. It's only asking what would follow if it were the case. As such, this type of inference is a bad inference. And nothing that we ask you on the exam will be asking you to prove this type of claim because it's an invalid item. And yeah, we wouldn't ever ask you to prove something that is invalid. We might give it to you and ask you to tell us why it's invalid, but you won't have something that looks like this. Most of the homework problems look more like this, where you use EE in order to make an EI move, like on line 6 right here, and then you more or less reiterate the EI move, but the citation is EE. I know that this is a bit of a data dump. All things considered, this is a rule that you're just going to have to practice and get used and accustomed to working with. If you don't take time to practice it, chances are you're going to make some mistakes. And also some of the weird moves that our book allows you to do might catch you by surprise. As we saw in lecture, for those that were there, EE is kind of like RAA in that, well, sometimes you're going to be reiterating things that you weren't expecting to be reiterating. And alas, that's just going to be something that we all have to practice.